This isn't imprisonment. This is another life. The sun beat down on the Texas plains, unrelenting, shimmering waves of heat rising from the dusty ground. A group of weary German prisoners stepped off the back of a U.S. Army truck, their boots crunching against dry gravel. These men, captured on the battlefields of North Africa and Europe, had braced themselves for barbed wire, guard towers, and endless punishment. Instead, what they found was cattle. A ranch foreman in a wide-brimmed hat strode toward them, a lasso slung casually over one shoulder. He tipped his hat and, through a translator, delivered a message that left the POWs stunned. "You boys will be helping us work the ranch, fence mending, cattle drives, whatever needs doing." The Germans exchanged glances of disbelief. These were men who had fought under the swastika, who had endured desert battles, tank engagements, and bombing raids. And now here in Texas, their new battlefield was the open range. Instead of machine guns, they were handed work gloves. Instead of shouting sergeants, they were guided by soft-spoken cowboys who measured a man not by ideology, but by how well he could wrangle a steer. One young prisoner, barely 20, stared out at the endless horizon. The land stretched on forever, bigger than anything he had seen in Europe. Another POW whispered in disbelief, "This isn't imprisonment. This is another life." Within days they were riding in the backs of pickup trucks, trailing herds under the blazing sun, watching cowboys whistle and call to the animals as if it were second nature. They were paid in canteen tokens, given hearty meals, and even allowed moments of freedom unthinkable in a time of war. For these German soldiers, Texas was not just captivity, it was culture shock, a collision between the old world and the Wild West. And as they adjusted to cowboy life, many of them began to realize something shocking. The Americans were not the brutal enemies Nazi propaganda had promised. They were ranchers, farmers, and neighbors, men who needed hands, not hatred. What began as disbelief would soon become one of the most unusual stories of World War II. For the German soldiers who had been captured in North Africa or Italy, the journey to America was filled with dread. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a land of chaos, lawlessness, and cruelty. They expected brutal camps, starvation, and humiliation at the hands of their captors. Instead, as the troop ships reached the port of Houston or Galveston, and the POWs were loaded onto trains bound for the Texas interior, they began to see something entirely different. Through the barred train windows stretched fields of wheat, endless ranch land, and towns that looked almost untouched by war. Children played in yards, shopkeepers tipped their hats, and the prisoners realized that America was not burning under bombs the way Germany was. Still, fear lingered. Many of the men whispered to each other in hushed tones. Would they be beaten? Would they be executed? The Geneva Convention had been mentioned, but who could trust the promises of the enemy? When the train stopped near the dusty towns of Central and West Texas, the prisoners expected barbed wire and armed guards. Yes, the camps were fenced and patrolled, but what shocked them was what lay outside the wire, ranch land stretching for miles, filled with cattle that needed tending. On their first day of assignment, many POWs could hardly believe it. The cowboys who greeted them weren't soldiers in uniforms. They were ordinary men in jeans, boots, and Stetsons. Men who had spent their entire lives under the wide Texas sky. They carried ropes, not rifles, and spoke with an easy drawl that baffled the Germans at first. One prisoner, Franz Gruber, later recalled in a memoir, "We were certain we would be treated like animals. Instead, they treated us like farmhands who simply spoke another language." It was humiliating and liberating at the same time. The misconception ran both ways. Many Texans raised on wartime posters and newsreels expected the German POWs to be fanatics, rabid Nazis who might lash out at any moment. But what they saw stepping off those trucks were thin, tired young men, more farm boys than soldiers. They were shocked at how polite, even deferential, many of the Germans were when faced with honest work. The collision of expectations created an atmosphere of uncertainty at first. The Germans didn't know whether to resist or comply. The Texans didn't know if their new workers could be trusted, but the land itself demanded answers. Fences had to be fixed, cattle had to be driven. The rhythm of ranch life would break down the barriers faster than speeches or orders ever could. And so began one of the strangest chapters of the war. German POWs once trained to kill Americans now herding their cattle under the Texas sun. By 1943, America faced a logistical problem that few could have anticipated at the start of the war. What to do with the massive influx of German prisoners? From the deserts of Tunisia to the fields of Sicily, Allied armies were capturing tens of thousands of Axis soldiers. Britain was already overcrowded with POWs, its resources stretched thin. The solution was clear. Ship them across the Atlantic, far from the front lines, to a place with plenty of land, food, and space. Texas, with its wide-open spaces and agricultural economy, became one of the primary destinations. By the end of the war, nearly 50,000 German POWs were held across the Lone Star State, spread among dozens of camps. The largest facilities like Camp Hearn, Camp Huntsville, and Camp Swift were built to handle thousands of men. Smaller branch camps were scattered across ranches and farms, housing dozens to hundreds at a time. These camps were not the barbed wire nightmares the Germans had feared. Yes, there were guard towers and fences, but they were constructed under the rules of the Geneva Convention. POWs had to be provided adequate shelter, food, medical care, and even opportunities for recreation. In practice, many of these camps offered better conditions than what German soldiers had experienced at the front. Prisoners were often stunned to receive plentiful meals, including meat, vegetables, and bread, while their families back in Germany survived on rationed turnips and sawdust bread. But the most surprising aspect of their captivity was work. The United States faced a severe labor shortage during the war, with millions of American men overseas. Farms and ranches struggled to keep up production. Congress authorized POW labor, and the Army struck agreements with local farmers and ranchers. Prisoners could be hired out for agricultural work, with wages paid to the U.S. government. In exchange, POWs received small allowances for use in camp canteens. For Texans, this was a win-win. They desperately needed hands to harvest cotton, cut sugarcane, and in the wide cattle country, help with ranch duties. For German prisoners, it was a bewildering turn of events. One day, they were fighting under Rommel in North Africa. The next, they were riding in a flatbed truck to mend fences in West Texas. The sight of German soldiers working the land became almost routine across rural Texas. Locals watched them fixing irrigation ditches, carrying hay bales, or driving cattle under the watchful eye of a handful of armed guards. What astonished many Texans was how quickly the prisoners adapted. Some POWs had grown up on German farms, familiar with livestock and heavy labor. They proved competent workers and often outpaced expectations. Cowboys were amused to see young Germans, who had once trained with rifles, now sweating in the Texas sun, learning to swing lassos or drive stubborn steers across pastures. The initial mistrust began to fade as both sides realized they shared something in common, a bond with the land and a respect for hard work. Still, there were cultural clashes. Germans were disciplined, accustomed to strict schedules and command structures. Ranch life, by contrast, was loose, pragmatic, and shaped by the needs of the moment. One cowboy later recalled with a grin, "Those Germans would line up their tools like it was the army. Out here, we just grab what works and get the job done." The background of these POW camps reveals a paradox. The United States had taken its enemy soldiers and, instead of treating them as dangerous captives, had turned them into an unexpected labor force. Texas ranchers saw them less as Nazis and more as able-bodied young men who could help keep cattle moving and crops growing. For the Germans, captivity in Texas was their first unfiltered glimpse of America. It wasn't the land of chaos and decay their leaders had described. It was a nation of vast land, endless cattle, and ordinary men who valued sweat more than slogans. The stage was set for lessons no propaganda could erase. Numbers told a story the German POWs could not ignore. In Europe, they had been taught that Germany was the pinnacle of discipline and organization, that their Reich had the resources and resolve to outlast any foe. But Texas forced them to confront a different kind of arithmetic, one measured not in tanks or rifles, but in cattle herds, acres of farmland, and the sheer scale of American abundance. Start with the labor shortage. By 1944, over 12 million American men were serving in uniform. Texas ranches, already sprawling and labor-intensive, were left with gaping holes in their workforce. German POWs filled those gaps. Nearly 50,000 Germans in Texas alone logged millions of man-hours in agriculture. Across the United States, POW labor provided the equivalent of more than 36,000 full-time workers, an invisible army keeping American food and raw materials flowing while the real army fought overseas. Then there was food. The average German soldier at the front received rations equivalent to 1,500 calories per day by 1944, barely enough to survive heavy labor. In Texas, POWs were shocked to find themselves fed on a 3,200-calorie daily ration, almost identical to that of U.S. troops. Meals often included beef, pork, bread, potatoes, and fresh vegetables. To men who had lived on black bread and watery soup, the abundance was surreal. Cattle told their own story. Texas ranches held an estimated 10 million head of cattle during the war years. The sheer scale of this livestock industry dwarfed what the Germans knew from Europe. One POW later wrote, "In Bavaria, a large farm might keep 20 cows. Here, a single rancher counted his herd in the thousands." That realization carried a painful message. America had so much food that even its prisoners could be well fed, while Germany's civilians starved. Money was another statistic of shock. POWs earned 80 cents per day in credit for their labor, paid not to them directly, but to the U.S. Army, which in turn provided them canteen tokens. With those tokens, prisoners could buy cigarettes, candy, soft drinks, and small luxuries. It was more spending power than many German civilians had at home in 1944, where inflation and shortages left store shelves bare. And perhaps the most devastating number of all, production. Many POWs arrived in Texas in 1943-44, the very years when American factories were hitting peak output. In 1944 alone, the U.S. produced 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and over 8 million tons of shipping. German officers in captivity, allowed to read American newspapers, realized with dread what those figures meant. Germany had built just 40,000 aircraft in the same year, with dwindling fuel and pilot training. Even the ranches demonstrated production power on a scale the Germans could hardly fathom. Cotton harvests, wheat shipments, beef cattle drives, all were massive coordinated operations carried out with tractors, trucks, and machinery that Germany simply could not match. For men raised in a country where farm work still relied heavily on horses and hand tools, Texas agriculture was an industrial operation in itself. These numbers cut deep. Each statistic revealed a painful truth. The Reich had promised them supremacy, but here in captivity they saw that America could outproduce, outfeed, and outlast them in every dimension. For the German POWs working under the Texas sun, the math of defeat was no longer abstract. It was in the herds that stretched beyond the horizon, the meals piled high in mess halls, the pay tokens jingling in their pockets. It was in the undeniable arithmetic of abundance versus scarcity. Numbers don't lie. And in Texas, the numbers told them Germany could never win. The first time a group of German POWs stepped onto a working Texas cattle ranch, they thought it was a trick. Prisoners expected armed drills, forced marches, or back-breaking punishment. Instead, they were handed shovels, fence posts, and feed sacks. The cowboy foreman gave them a demonstration, speaking in a slow drawl that most couldn't understand. Then pointed at the tools and gestured toward a broken fence line. The message was clear: get to work. At first, the Germans balked. They had fought for the Wehrmacht, worn the eagle on their uniforms, and now here they were being asked to do the work of ranch hands. A few refused to touch the tools, insisting such labor was degrading. But hunger and boredom are powerful motivators. Within hours, most had picked up hammers and wire, following the lead of the Cowboys. It didn't take long for the disbelief to give way to grudging respect. Ranch life was brutally hard. The Texas sun was unforgiving, burning down on men who had grown up under the softer skies of Europe. The distances were vast. A short ride to check a herd could take hours across rough open land, and the cattle themselves were nothing like the docile dairy cows of Bavaria. Texas Longhorns were stubborn, massive, and sometimes dangerous, requiring skill and courage to control. One young POW named Dieter Vogel wrote in his post-war diary, "I had fought in Tunisia, marched across Sicily, survived bombardments, yet it was here in Texas, chasing cattle that could crush a man, that I realized I was no longer a soldier, but something else entirely, a worker of the land. For the Cowboys, the first days were just as strange. Many had lost brothers or sons in the war. They had expected German soldiers to be arrogant, maybe violent. Instead, what they saw were skinny young men, many barely in their 22nd, sweating, fumbling with barbed wire, or struggling to lift heavy hay bales. They weren't Nazis, one cowboy later said. They were just boys who got caught up in a war. Out here, work made us all the same. The POWs quickly discovered that their captors treated them with a surprising level of humanity. If they worked hard, they were rewarded with decent meals. They were given water breaks, shade when the sun was high, and sometimes even a chance to share a laugh with the ranch hands. The Cowboys joked that the Germans were free labor with accents, but some admitted privately that the men reminded them of themselves. By the end of their first week, the POWs had learned some basic ranching skills: how to mend fences with wire and posts, how to drive a herd across pasture, and how to haul feed sacks without spilling half of it. Their bodies ached in ways the battlefield hadn't prepared them for. But they also began to sense something strange. These Americans didn't hate them. They were not treated as mortal enemies, but as men who could pull their weight. The first field test of this arrangement came during a cattle drive. The Germans were loaded into trucks and brought to open range, where hundreds of cattle had to be moved into pens for branding. It was chaos at first. Cattle bolted in every direction. Dust filled the air, and the POWs stumbled over themselves, trying to follow orders shouted in English. Cowboys rode horseback through the dust, swinging lassos with practiced ease. For the POWs, it was a spectacle straight out of a Wild West movie. By the end of the day, though, they had contributed. Their hands were blistered, their uniforms soaked with sweat, but they had helped drive a herd into its pen. That night in camp, over dinner, they talked about it in hushed voices. This was not captivity as they had imagined. It was labor, yes, but it carried a strange dignity. The Germans had been sent to Texas as prisoners, but their first days on the ranch revealed something they hadn't expected. They were being turned into cowboys. The POWs soon realized that ranch work was not just about fixing fences or wrangling cattle. It was a system, a living machine, where every small task contributed to something far larger. They had been trained as soldiers to think in terms of orders and obedience, but Texas ranching taught them the math of survival in a different form. Take the fences. One broken post might seem trivial, but on a ranch it meant cattle straying, herds scattering, and days of wasted labor. Fixing one fence saved hours of chasing cows across miles of land. For men who had watched tanks break down from a missing part or supply lines collapse from a single bottleneck, the lesson was clear. Efficiency meant everything. Feeding the herds offered another revelation. A few sacks of grain dumped at the wrong time could cause cattle to stampede, injuring both animals and men. But done correctly at dawn in measured portions, the entire herd could be kept calm, fattened, and ready for market. It was a rhythm, not unlike the precision of military drill, but driven by nature rather than command. And then there was water. Texas summers were merciless, rivers running dry, ponds shrinking to cracked mud. POWs learned quickly that hauling water wasn't a chore, it was life itself. A miscalculation meant dead cattle, which meant lost income, which meant failure for the ranch. They began to see how American prosperity wasn't built only on factories and machines. It was built on an understanding of how to manage resources at scale. For German officers among the prisoners, these lessons were humiliating in their clarity. They had been told that Germany's discipline, willpower, and superior tactics would win the war. Yet here they were mending fences with American cowboys who understood instinctively the logistics of keeping thousands of cattle alive. The contrast was crushing. The math of collapse followed them into camp at night. A single guard armed with a rifle could oversee dozens of POWs because the prisoners knew that escape was futile. The distances were too vast, the land too empty. A man could walk for days and find nothing but dust, cattle, and endless horizon. Many calculated in their heads, even if I escape, where would I go? How would I eat? The ranch itself acted as a prison without walls. But the most devastating realization was hidden in plain sight. If America could spare thousands of enemy soldiers to mend fences, drive herds, and harvest crops, then what did that say about the country's manpower? The POWs knew that back home in Germany, civilians were being forced into war industries, old men and teenagers dragged into service. In Texas, America was so rich in resources that it could afford to feed its prisoners steak while its cowboys, too old or too young for the draft, kept the home front running. The numbers haunted them. Tens of thousands of cattle, millions of acres of land, food production on a scale they had never dreamed possible. It wasn't just about ranching. It was about seeing America's hidden weapon, abundance multiplied by efficiency. As one German lieutenant later admitted after the war, "We thought America was soft, that they would never fight long. But when I saw how their land produced, how even prisoners were made useful, I knew the truth. We were fighting not just an army, but an entire system of wealth and power. We could never match it." The collapse wasn't just military, it was psychological. Texas ranchers had taught German POWs that America's strength wasn't in slogans or ideology. It was in numbers, in the simple math of production, survival, and scale. If hard work and efficiency broke down the Germans' illusions of superiority, it was the cowboy culture itself that reshaped how they thought about America. At first, the POWs viewed the cowboys as rustic, uneducated men, simple ranch hands who happened to be born in a wealthy nation. But the longer they worked side by side, the more complicated the picture became. These weren't just herders of cattle. They were mechanics, logisticians, veterinarians, and leaders all in one. They could ride a horse at dawn, weld broken equipment by noon, and haggle over cattle prices at dusk. To men trained in rigid military hierarchies, the cowboy was a paradox. Independent yet disciplined, rough yet deeply skilled. Language barriers fell quickly. Cowboys taught German prisoners English words for tools, animals, and chores. Post-hole digger, branding iron, saddle horn. The Germans, in turn, shared songs, stories, and their own tricks for repairs learned on European farms. Soon the camps echoed with strange mixes of German and Texan slang, a hybrid language born of necessity and camaraderie. What struck the POWs most was the American attitude toward work. In Germany, labor was often seen as something to endure, commanded by authority. In Texas, work carried pride. Cowboys boasted not about medals or ranks, but about how many cattle they'd moved in a day, how quickly they could mend a fence line, or how cleanly they could brand a steer. The Germans began to grasp that America's strength was rooted in this culture, a belief that honest, productive labor was not humiliation, but honor. Then there was the food. Ranch meals became legendary among the prisoners. Enormous breakfasts of bacon, eggs, and biscuits. Midday meals of chili, cornbread, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, as the cowboys joked. Suppers with steak, beans, and pies the size of wagon wheels. For men used to meager wartime rations, the abundance was astonishing. Even more astonishing was the casual generosity. Cowboys often shared meals with POWs, treating them less like enemies and more like fellow workers. Around the campfires, conversations stretched into long evenings. Cowboys asked about life in Germany, about families left behind, about how ordinary Germans viewed Hitler. The POWs in turn asked why America fought, why it had entered the war at all when it was so far from Europe. The answers they received were rarely political. Cowboys spoke of Pearl Harbor, of friends and brothers gone to fight, of a belief that tyranny anywhere was a threat to freedom, everywhere. These talks planted seeds of doubt. The prisoners had been raised on propaganda portraying Americans as decadent, weak, and greedy. Yet here they saw men who lived simply, worked fiercely, and treated even their enemies with a rough sense of fairness. A few POWs even began to wonder whether they had been fighting for the wrong vision of the future. The cultural lessons extended beyond ideology. The Germans marveled at the cowboys' resourcefulness. A boot worn through at the sole would be patched with leather scraps and nails, lasting another season. A lasso made from old rope would be spliced and knotted until it was almost as strong as new. Nothing went to waste, yet nothing was treated with reverence. Tools existed to be used, not worshipped. For POWs coming from a society obsessed with rigid order and ritual, This practicality was refreshing and humbling. And then there was freedom. The cowboys embodied it in every gesture. They answered to no officer's bark, no daily salute. Their authority came from skill, not from rank. A man who could rope the wildest steer or ride through the toughest storm earned respect without a uniform. The POWs saw this and recognized a form of power they had never known. Not imposed, but earned. Not commanded, but granted. By the end of 1944, many German POWs admitted quietly that the Texas ranchers had taught them more about America than any guard tower or barbed wire fence ever could. These cowboys were not the caricatures they had imagined. They were the human face of a nation that combined freedom with discipline, abundance with hard work. For men who once believed themselves the heirs of Europe's mightiest tradition, this revelation cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. America, they realized, had built not just an army, but a way of life that even its prisoners could not help but admire. By late 1944, the initial skepticism that had defined the German POWs' arrival in Texas was giving way to something far more complex: respect. What began as curiosity and cautious tolerance slowly transformed into working relationships, friendships, and in some cases, a kind of mutual admiration between prisoners, guards, and cowboys. At first, the barriers had been stark. The POWs feared brutality. They had heard horror stories from Nazi propaganda. American camps were said to starve or torture prisoners, turning them into propaganda tools. The reality was different. Instead of whips and starvation, they found cigarettes and work assignments. Instead of cruelty, they encountered discipline mixed with a surprising degree of humanity. The guards played a unique role in shaping this environment. Many were young Americans, barely older than the prisoners themselves, often hailing from rural backgrounds. Not unlike the Germans. They knew little German, and their charges knew little English. But necessity forced a kind of communication, a gesture, a whistle, a word here and there. Over time, trust began to emerge. One German prisoner, a former mechanic from Hamburg, later recalled, "The guard watching us was about my age. He showed me how to use a new kind of wrench. We laughed when I fumbled with it. In that moment, I forgot I was a prisoner." For many POWs, these interactions chipped away at the black and white image of Americans as faceless enemies. The cowboys accelerated this process even more. Unlike guards bound by military protocol, ranchers often treated POWs as workers first and prisoners second. They needed strong backs and quick hands to handle the endless chores of ranch life. And so long as the Germans did the job, they were seen as part of the team. The prisoners, many of whom came from rural villages in Germany, were no strangers to farm life, fixing fences, tending animals, hauling supplies. All of this was familiar work, but the cowboy culture wrapped those tasks in a mystique that fascinated them. Saddling a horse, riding across endless plains, rounding up cattle under the blazing sun. These were experiences far removed from the ordered fields of Bavaria or the industrial outskirts of the Ruhr. Over time, the cowboys began to respect the Germans for their diligence, and the Germans began to respect the cowboys for their toughness. One Texas rancher wrote in his journal, "Those boys work hard. They gripe sometimes, but they never quit. Reminds me of us." A German prisoner later reflected, "They treated us like men, not slaves. That shocked us more than the food." There were small acts of kindness that bridged the divide. A cowboy slipped an extra slice of pie to a homesick prisoner. A German POW carved wooden toys for a rancher's children. Guards turned a blind eye when POWs were allowed to ride horses after chores, a privilege unthinkable in stricter camps. Yet these relationships weren't built on sentimentality alone. They were forged in labor, in the sweat of long days, and in the shared silence of campfires at night. That labor carried symbolic weight. For POWs, it was a reminder that dignity could be found even in captivity. For Americans, it was proof that their way of life, rooted in freedom, work, and abundance, was strong enough to absorb even its enemies without fear. Some prisoners began writing letters home describing their experiences with a mixture of disbelief and envy. They wrote about the size of the cattle herds, the abundance of food, the strength of the horses, and the fairness of their overseers. These letters were censored, but enough details slipped through to astonish families back in Germany. One POW wrote simply, "Here, even prisoners live better than free men at home." The bonds formed in Texas didn't end with the war. When repatriation came, some Germans stayed in touch with the ranchers they had worked alongside. A few returned years later as immigrants, eager to start new lives in the land that had once held them captive. In the end, what emerged from the fields and ranches of Texas wasn't just a story of prisoners and guards. It was the story of men meeting across cultural divides, stripped of propaganda, and learning through sweat, work, and small kindnesses that even enemies could share respect. When the war finally ended in 1945, German POWs across America began the slow process of repatriation. For those who had spent their captivity in Texas, the memories they carried back were not of barbed wire and guard towers, but of wide skies, endless cattle herds, and cowboys who had shown them a very different face of America. For many, the greatest shock was returning to Germany itself. The homeland they had left years earlier was in ruins. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden lay flattened by Allied bombing. Railways were broken, bridges destroyed, factories reduced to rubble. Food was scarce, housing even scarcer. Families were fragmented, some displaced, others grieving losses too heavy to speak aloud. To men who had just spent years eating steak and biscuits on Texas ranches, the contrast was devastating. They had lived as prisoners with more abundance than their families had experienced as free citizens under the Reich. One former POW wrote in his memoir, "I left America a prisoner, and I returned to Germany a beggar. My brothers at home were thinner and weaker than I had ever seen them. Yet I, the prisoner, was healthier than when I left." That paradox shaped the legacy of Texas captivity. These men became witnesses to an undeniable truth. America's wealth wasn't just propaganda. It was real, and it flowed from a combination of industrial power, agricultural abundance, and a culture that valued productivity above ideology. Some former prisoners carried bitterness, struggling with guilt at having eaten so well while their families starved. Others carried inspiration. They had seen how Americans solved problems with efficiency rather than excuses, how labor was organized, and how ordinary people, cowboys, mechanics, guards lived in relative comfort while treating even their enemies with a rough equality. For many, these lessons influenced their role in rebuilding post-war Germany. Thousands of ex-POWs would become farmers, engineers, and small business owners in the new West Germany. They brought with them practices they had seen firsthand: crop rotation methods used on Texan farms, cattle ranching techniques, and even organizational ideas like standardized equipment and efficient work schedules. The cultural lessons were just as profound. Former prisoners often spoke of the respect they had developed for America's informal equality. They had seen cowboys treat them as men, not merely as prisoners. They had seen guards enforce discipline, but also share cigarettes and laughter. These experiences undermined years of Nazi propaganda that portrayed Americans as decadent weaklings or cruel exploiters. There were also lasting personal ties. Letters crossed the Atlantic for years after the war, as POWs wrote to ranch families who had fed them, worked alongside them, or treated them with kindness. Some were even invited back, and a small number immigrated permanently, becoming American citizens and settling in the very land where they had once been prisoners. For the wider German population, the stories of these men served as testimony that the future lay not in clinging to the old militarism, but in embracing new ways of life. If America's abundance could be replicated, not in hamburgers and Coca-Cola alone, but in the principles of efficiency, innovation, and fairness, then perhaps Germany could rise again, not as a destroyer, but as a builder. In the years to come, West Germany's economic miracle would astonish the world. While many factors contributed, the influence of ex-POWs who had seen firsthand what industrial and agricultural abundance looked like in America cannot be overlooked. The lessons learned in Texas ranches, in dusty cattle pens, and around campfires where cowboys swapped stories helped sow seeds of transformation. By the time these men were old, many would reflect not only on the war they had fought, but on the captivity that had reshaped their lives. What they remembered most were not battles lost, but the human encounters won. The meals shared, the fences mended, the cattle driven, the kindnesses exchanged. The legacy of Texas captivity was this: A generation of Germans, once sworn enemies of America, returned home with respect, humility, and in many cases, admiration for the very nation that had defeated them. In the math of war, that was a victory that no bomb or bullet could have delivered. The story of German POWs in Texas is one of the strangest paradoxes of the Second World War. Men who marched into captivity expecting starvation, abuse, or humiliation, instead found themselves eating steak, drinking coffee, and riding horses under the watchful eyes of American cowboys. What had begun with fear and suspicion ended with respect, admiration, and lessons carried across an ocean. The barbed wire was still there, the guard towers still stood, yet within those boundaries, something remarkable happened: the collapse of propaganda. These men had been told America was weak, decadent, and incapable of serious sacrifice. But on the ranches of Texas, they learned that America's strength came not from rigid hierarchy or ideology, but from abundance, adaptability, and a belief that work itself was honorable. The image of the cowboy, dusty boots, lasso in hand, cattle stretching across the horizon, was more than a symbol of a region. For German prisoners, it was a living contradiction to everything they had been told. Cowboys were not aristocrats, nor soldiers, nor politicians. Yet they commanded respect. They had skills, freedom, and a kind of unshakable confidence born of independence. To men trained to salute, rank, and obey blindly, this was a revelation. The food, too, became a weapon of quiet power. Biscuits, beans, chili, steaks, and coffee showed the sheer scale of America's agricultural capacity. A POW could sit at a ranch table and eat better than his family in Hamburg or Munich. That fact alone shattered the illusion that Germany's struggle was sustainable. If America could feed even its prisoners in such abundance, how could Germany ever hope to outlast it? When these men returned home, they carried more than memories of ranch work. They carried proof that America's power wasn't just military. It was cultural, agricultural, industrial, and deeply human. And in the rebuilding of West Germany, many applied those lessons: the efficiency, the resourcefulness, the belief that prosperity could be created through hard work rather than seized through conquest. All of it echoed what they had witnessed behind barbed wire in Texas. In the end, cattle ranchers and cowboys accomplished something armies could not. They turned enemies into witnesses. They broke apart myths stronger than steel, and they left an indelible reminder that in total war, strength is not only measured in weapons, but in the ability to turn even captivity into a lesson in abundance. The POWs came as prisoners. They left as witnesses to America's greatest weapon, a way of life that turned labor into dignity, scarcity into plenty, and enemies into reluctant admirers.